Today, on this very special edition of AMI This Week, we sit down with the Honourable Carla Qualtrough.
Having the opportunity to have been Canada's first ever minister responsible for people with disabilities is something that I will, carry with me whatever I end up doing for the rest of my life.
This is AMI This Week. Hello and welcome to this special episode of AMI This Week. We're your hosts. I'm Victoria Nolan.
And I'm Anthony McLaughlin. As you just heard in our intro, today we are sharing our exclusive sit-down interview with the Honourable Carla Qualtrough.
And as most of you probably know, Minister Qualtrough is Canada's former Minister of Sports and Persons with a Disability.
And was recently promoted into the position of Minister of Public Services and Procurement.
So before we kick things off, we should mention Vancouver's Grant Hardy sat down with her before that announcement.
He sure did, but that doesn't mean that anything of what she shared with us is any less relevant. In fact, it's all pretty incredible, just like she is herself.
That's for sure. That's why Grant started the conversation with a very simple yet complex question.
How would you describe yourself?
That's a good question. I mean, first and foremost, I always tell people I'm a mom. So I have 4 kids, and that's the thing that matters most to me in the world. And after that, I'm a whole bunch of other things, right? I'm a politician, I'm a lawyer, I'm an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, and I don't know, just someone who really cares about doing the best job she can.
So I'm interested in hearing a bit about your experiences growing up and what your childhood was like, both socially and academically.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I was born in Calgary, and my parents moved early in my life when I was 4 to Langley, British Columbia, and that's where I grew up and did my schooling and my high schooling. And I was very involved in sport. Sport has been a big factor in my life and my family's life since the very beginning. So we did every sport imaginable. And it really defined how I looked at the world, in terms of I was a natural rule follower. I liked being part of a team. I was quite disciplined. I learned a lot of lessons through sport that have been really helpful. But at one point in sport, the fact that I'm legally blind really caught up to me. So, I played soccer, but then the ball would get too fast and I would lose sight of the ball. Or I was involved in curling and able-bodied curling, or even softball for a long time. But everything just got too fast at a certain point, and that's when I found Paralympic sport. And quite frankly, that was probably a TSN turning point in my life, just in terms of being exposed to a system of sport where they leveled the playing field. So the fact that I have this disability didn't really impact my performance on the field of play in the way that it had prior to that in other sport experience that I had. And I tried a number of sports, again, in Paralympic sport, but I ultimately landed in swimming and found out I was pretty darn good at it and ended up traveling the country and then ultimately traveling the world. And I became fascinated with the idea of creating systems that would level the playing field. So for me, that one was sport at first, but I thought, what if we could create a transportation system or an employment system or another system where we would level the playing field for everyone from the beginning, and we didn't have to accommodate people after the fact or people weren't feeling included. And so it really exposed me to a way of looking at the world that's carried on through my entire life.
Do you think your family really made you passionate about sports, or where does that come from, do you think?
I think it is connected to my involvement in the Paralympic movement, and again, exposure to both the high performance side of that through my own experience, but exposure to the idea of using sport as a tool for broader social change. The idea that you can use sport as a tool, in Canada we're using it as a tool for reconciliation. So reconciling with Aboriginal peoples through sport, or teaching people who maybe don't think people with disabilities can do things, showing them through sport that we can do anything. And just, this idea of achieving, sport is not just an end, it's a means. It's a way we can address public policy issues like obesity or youth at risk or reconciliation. So it's a really interesting just way of looking at the world that I've found. Sport has also shown me the world. I got to travel the world. I was exposed to incredible demonstrations of ability through Paralympic sport, but also incredible discrimination. And that's what actually prompted me, in law school to become a human rights lawyer.
So tell me a little bit more about that, your experience throughout law school.
Law school. Well, I did my undergraduate degree in political science, surprise, surprise, in French in Ottawa, because I wanted to keep going with my French after I was in French immersion, and knew that if I wanted to be involved in government, having French would be a really important part of that. And I was really interested in our political and constitutional history. That was the thing that caught my attention. Again, the history of our rights movements for various, marginalized populations, including, of course, people with disabilities, or primarily people with disabilities. And then when I got to law school, it just was a natural fit that human rights and any kind of rights drew me in, just the way we looked at rights. And really was fascinated again by this idea that fundamentally for a long time the way we've looked at rights in Canada is by building things, whether it be a building or a policy or a process or a system that doesn't include everybody, but then we have a legal obligation to accommodate. And I think there's got to be a better way of doing that, right? Like, why would we ever build something that isn't inclusive from the beginning?
Yeah.
And so that became the way I looked at the world through law school, was not this kind of reactive duty to accommodate, which is still the law and still a very important component of our law. But again, what if we stopped waiting for people to be discriminated against before we could help them? And that was a frustration, because I ended up litigating with the Human Rights Commission federally and then with the BC Human Rights Tribunal. And it always frustrated me that we had to just wait until someone was denied a job or denied a service or denied housing. And then we would sweep in and we would all agree that was wrong, but it took years and it cost a lot of money. Like, what if we just had policies and just systems in place that insisted that these things be inclusive from the beginning?
Universal design.
Yeah, or whatever it is, in a policy, or yeah, absolutely. And that's what our new accessibility legislation is trying to achieve.
Well, we'll definitely be touching on that a little later. I'm looking forward to it.
As I said, she is pretty incredible.
I love listening to her thoughts. I've heard those ideas before, but never in such a straightforward and passionate way. I can't wait to hear what she has to say about accessibility legislation.
Well, as Grant said, that's coming up later. In fact, right after this short break. Stay with us. AMI This Week will return.
You're watching AMI This Week.
Welcome back to this very special edition of AMI This Week. We're your hosts. I'm Anthony McLaughlin, and with me is Victoria Nolan.
For those of you who are just joining us, today we are sharing our exclusive sit-down interview with the Honourable Carla Qualtrough.
We sure are, and before the break, we promised to share her thoughts on the new accessibility legislation.
AMI's Grant Hardy did not shy away from asking some very difficult questions.
Would you consider Canada to be accessible? And can you give some examples of strengths and weaknesses?
It's a good question. And, the term accessible is so subjective, right? There's no objective kind of test for accessibility. And when I talk about accessibility, I mean it in its broadest sense of the term. So I would even say inclusion. But, we've chosen the word accessibility because it has a stricter kind of relationship with the disability community. In some ways, yeah, I think that Canada is accessible. Is there a lot of work to be done? Absolutely. Are we ahead of some countries? For sure. Are we behind some countries? Probably. I would say that our policies, I've got pretty high standards, Grant, so I say that I would err on the side of we've got a lot of work to do. Are we inclusive? For sure, right? Are our kind of disability rights issues less significant than other countries? Yeah. But there's a lot we can do, right? The point of this is we know what needs to be done, and there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah. Why do you think that Canada needs national accessibility legislation?
Well, as we've discussed before, I think that we have a really robust human rights system in Canada, and it spells out very clearly that we're not supposed, it's against the law to discriminate against someone with a disability, in employment and housing and service provision and programming, and all of that's laid out. The challenge or the hiccup there is that we have to wait until people are discriminated against. And the process is timely, and it's costly, and it's burdensome. So we know it's not an ideal process from a proactive inclusion lens, if you will. So I believe that a national, what used to be called Canadians with Disability Act, or what the working title for our law is accessibility legislation. That might not be what it ends up being called, but that's what we're calling it. I think the goal of this is to, remove barriers and really create expectations or standards that will proactively address discrimination before it happens.
Now, I know that, I believe between July 2016 and February of this year, 2017, there was fairly extensive consultation done by the government on this new planned legislation. What was your role in that process, and also what was the experience like?
Well, my role was, again, I hate to use another sport term, but I was the quarterback. So we designed the process. We hit 18 different cities around the country. We had an online component. We did a survey. And we wanted to really talk to Canadians with disabilities in particular about what an accessible Canada looked like to them and what elements they thought or we thought we should put in this law. It was extraordinary. And I can tell you that, in some ways, we as a community have been consulted to death. And people have asked us a lot, and there hasn't been a lot of action. So there was some skepticism at the beginning that this was just going to be another, process that would result in some report that would be put on a shelf and wouldn't be acted upon. But I can tell you that as the momentum built and as people really understood that we were listening and that, people started saying, okay, Carla, we're with you. Right? Okay, we're going to take this leap with you, and we're gonna tell you what our dreams are for our kids with disabilities, or what, as a young person with a disability, what barriers I'm facing to inclusion are. And it was really a powerful experience. It was seriously one of the highlights of my career.
Cool. What were some of those key concerns, issues, dreams that Canadians said they had?
Oh, you've got parents with young children with disabilities wondering, are they going to have an inclusive education experience? You've got a lot of young people with more significant, so young, this is going to date me, but so I would say like the 18 to 25 crowd who are trying to figure out, what their employment options are, and they're concerned that because they have a disability they won't be hired or they'll be underemployed, and everything in between, from medical assistance in dying to immigration policy to employment. Employment was a big one that was a real common theme across the country. But people talking very openly and candidly about the barriers they face in their day-to-day lives. The challenge, of course, for us is we're the federal government. So this law is going to impact federal jurisdiction, not provincial jurisdiction. But my commitment to Canadians and to everybody is, I didn't want to halt the conversation because technically this isn't in federal jurisdiction or that isn't in. So, we're going to work with the provinces and make sure they know that people are saying this is a concern. So I'll give you an example, Grant. So, you have a bank and it's next door to a credit union. And as the average citizen, it doesn't matter to you that the bank is federal jurisdiction and the credit union is provincial jurisdiction. So we could have a situation where there's different standards for the bank and the credit union. But you go to Van City or RBC, you expect a certain level of customer service. So I'm really committed to making sure that we harmonize across jurisdictions. And that's no small feat. I can tell you, federal-provincial relationships is a really tough nut to crack in any file, and this one's no exception.
Mm-hmm. I think that some people would ask why you think it's taken this long for Canada and some of the provinces to even get to this point.
You know what? I would suggest that disability rights in Canada is the last group of rights that we have to tackle as a country. Right, so we are years, probably decades behind the women's rights movement. We are behind Indigenous reconciliation in terms of righting the wrongs of the past, if you will. Because quite frankly, the history of how we've treated people with disabilities in this country is not a proud one. And we have done horrible things to our citizens with disabilities. We've lobotomized, we have institutionalized, we've castrated, we've taken kids away from their parents. We've outlawed sign language in the early 20th century. Like, the things we have done, we need to make right. Mm-hmm. And I think we need as a country to kind of own that. Right now, I'm not asking for a grand apology of, that's not the solution, but the solution is to level the playing field. And the solution is to create this law. It's not a sophisticated lobby in some ways as other rights movements are. There hasn't been an uprising, there hasn't been a galvanizing event, but I would suggest that the consultations we've done have brought the community together in a way that perhaps historically at a national level the disability community has not been brought together. But again, with doing that, I've created really big expectations.
What do you do to take all of those concerns and ideas that you heard during the public consultations and consolidate them down into formal requirements?
Well, to your point, so we produced a report in June of this year, and it talked about the things that Canadians were calling for. So they want a consistent experience of accessibility across the country. They want some kind of accessibility commissioner or some kind of independent body that will oversee if people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They want standards. They want businesses to be told the level of service and accessibility that we expect as a government. So there's the legal part of it. So there's actually drafting the law. What do we put in the law? They want us to codify or put into law the UN, our obligations under the UN Convention of the Rights of the Disabled. So there's a whole bunch of things that we could put in this law. And that's going to be a really important part of it, and we're going to be making history with the law, but in some ways the law is the bones, right? And we need to put some meat on those bones. So we need to surround this law with complementary programs and initiatives and resources to make sure that this is a success. So, we're going to obligate employers to be accessible, to have hiring practices that are inclusive. Well, what is that going to cost? And what does that look like? And how are we going to help? Because we want people to succeed in this. We don't want to, this isn't an exercise in compliance. This isn't, there will be a compliance aspect for sure, but the point isn't to catch everybody being inaccessible. The point is to make Canada accessible. So what kind of other things, in the federal government itself, we have to get our own house in order. So how do we become an accessible employer? How do we become an accessible procurer of goods? IT, there's so many aspects. So as much as the law is at the center of this grant, it's the catalyst, right? It's the thing that's going to force us to look at our policies and programs and services differently.
One question I would have would be the employment issue. What do you think we should do about that?
Oh, you know what? Employment is the biggest nut we have to crack in the disability community, right? And I'm not saying it's on us to do that, but fundamentally speaking, we are, unemployed or underemployed for the most part. I would suggest that the current employment service / programs that have been in place forever aren't creating the opportunities that I think we should be. I think, quite frankly, Grant, we have to talk about the business case more. It's a tough one. It's a tough one for me to kind of shift from the mindset of, the human rights lawyer who stands up on her pedestal and talks about it being the law and it's, or the kind of moral obligation about it's the right thing to do. But I tell you, when I stand in front of a board of trade and 400 people and I say, do you know you don't have access to 14% of consumers? Do you know that, you have a labor shortage and I have an untapped labor pool? When you start talking the language of business and you stop talking about, rights and obligations, which are there, people start listening. And so that's one of the shifts that we are making kind of in our conversation. And we're looking at putting together a kind of a national advisory committee on employment to really just almost boldly redefine how we're going to tackle employment in this country. And again, the challenge, though, is this is a federal provincial issue. Most disability supports are provincial, right? So, what limits does a federal politician have in terms of influencing provincial policy? I can be a leader for sure, but fundamentally, there's a lot of collaboration that's going to have to happen with the provinces.
Yeah.
One of the things I need to stress is that this new law will not directly create jobs, right? So it's not going to be a law that has quotas in it or that kind of thing. But hopefully, if we get it right, and I think we're going to, it's going to create a better environment for people to get jobs. Because if you can get into the building, you can work there. If your IT is accessible, you can work there. If they have an inclusive customer service policy, you can work there. If you can shop there, you can work there. So if we do all this other stuff, hopefully there will be kind of a spin-off for employment.
That's super.
Yeah, well, we're trying.
Awesome. Is there a really surprising thing that you learned throughout this process?
I think I'm always slightly surprised, sometimes shocked, to be honest, by how long government takes to move, right? So you have a big idea and you just want to do it. And as a cabinet minister, you don't know how long you're going to be in your portfolio, so you want to get it done, right? So I think, heck, you and I could sit down and come up with what this should be in this law. But then as a government, you have to understand there's bigger processes in play. And so for me, it's always the time, it's a big ship to have to steer, and so my patience is constantly tested in terms of how long it takes to get things done.
I really appreciate her honesty, and she is reinforcing the concern that so many Canadians with disabilities have, and that is unemployment and underemployment.
Well, she's definitely a great advocate. Do you think she had any idea that she was soon going to be promoted out of her role as the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disabilities when she conducted the interview?
Well, I don't know about that, but it's obvious that she's committed to inclusion and equity. She's passionate about the power of sport and physical activity to change lives, and she will champion diversity no matter what role or position she has.
I completely agree. Stay with us because after the break, we have more with the Honourable Carla Qualtrough. More to come on AMI This Week.
You're watching AMI This Week. Welcome back. We're your hosts. I'm Victoria Nolan, and with me is Anthony McLaughlin.
Today, we have devoted our entire show to our exclusive sit-down interview with the Honourable Carla Qualtrough.
And we're not done yet. Coming up next, Vancouver's Grant Hardy starts by asking Carla her thoughts on getting mainstream media involved and interested in raising awareness about inclusion and diversity. Here's what she said.
It's incredibly important, right? Because we know how impactful and influential mainstream media can be on kind of the collective consciousness of citizens. And one of the things that we have to our advantage is the aging population and the fact that more and more Canadians are going to be directly impacted by disability in a way that historically that hasn't been the case. You know, whether it's because infant mortality rates of more complex disabilities is going down, so people are surviving complex disabilities longer. People, you know, that people are living longer and are acquiring more disabilities. So there's more Canadians are impacted by disability. And quite frankly, more affluent Canadians are impacted by disability. So you have all the baby boomers who are heading into their retirements and are going to insist on accessible condos and accessible services and accessible businesses, and they've got money to spend. So I think that we are at a very interesting time, and the media is going to pick up on this because in a way it's no longer a minority issue. This is a majority issue, because whether it's you directly or your mother, somebody is going to be impacted, you know, first person by disability right now in a way that historically that's never been the case. Yeah. So the mainstream media is going to pay attention to this.
Yeah. Do you have advice for people with disabilities who are maybe struggling a little bit or having trouble being included, overcoming their own barriers?
You know what, I would say in a very real way, having a disability means you have to be, your confidence has to come from within. Right? You don't necessarily get those external validations. You know, I walk into a room, I don't see a bunch of people smiling at me to give me encouragement as I'm going to make a speech in front of 500 people. Or I think that, you know, be confident in yourself, and that's easier said than done. I totally get that. But also really understand that what you need and the accommodations or, you know, doing things differently or whatever we want to call it is completely separate from who you are and your skills and your experience and what you have to offer the world. It doesn't matter if you have to walk into a job interview and explain that you need a different piece of software or a different monitor to do the job. That is not in any way related to your ability to do that job. It just means you're going to do the job differently. And quite frankly, businesses are looking for innovators, and you should understand that as someone with a disability, you've been innovating your entire life because you grew up in a world that wasn't made for you. And so just having the confidence that you can innovate and telling somebody what you need is not in any way saying that you can't do a job or you can't be included in some program or whatever it is. And I think that's really an important lesson to learn. The other thing, quite frankly, it's a little more harsh is it feels like it's always on us to be able to explain what we need. And the more you can explain what you need, the better position you'll be in to get it. And, you know, as much as we can say that it's up to other people to be open to knowing what we need or anticipating, bottom line is, you know, Grant, your, you know, visual impairment or blindness is you're gonna have different needs than I am. Mm-hmm. So the more we can own the things we need and be confidently able to tell people, the better we're all gonna be.
Thank you. What do you hope your legacy will be?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, you know, my job is my legacy. So having the opportunity to have been Canada's first ever minister responsible for people with disabilities is something that I will, you know, carry with me whatever I end up doing for the rest of my life. More tangibly, I think our accessibility legislation. I think that I think that when history is written, this will be looked at as a turning point in the disability rights movement in Canada, where we really decided, as a population, as a government, that we were going to make Canada inclusive of people with disabilities.
It has been really incredible meeting you and having the chance to chat with you. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you. Your questions were excellent.
Just incredible. Some really wonderful thoughts and advice from our minister there.
I can't wait to see how it all rolls out. Our new Minister of Sport and Persons with a Disability, Kent Hare, has a huge job ahead of him and some big shoes to fill.
He sure does. We congratulate him and wish him the best of luck.
We sure do. And once again, a big thank you to the Honourable Carla Qualtrough.
On that note, that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks for watching.
And listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Hosts Anthony McLaughlin, Victoria Nolan. Presenter Grant Hardy. Producers Michelle Dudas, Amit Tandon. Videographers Sergio Vera-Barahona. Cynthia Valenzuela Cobo. Integrated Described Video Specialist Ron Rickford. Editor Andrew Antonello. Audio Post Santiago Moffat. Director Production Kara Nye. Director Programming AMI TV Brian Perdue. Vice President Programming and Production John Melville. President and CEO David Arrington. Copyright 2017 Accessible Media Incorporated.